Welcome to America This Week, and we are talking this week about a huge story. You know, Pope Francis has really rocked the Catholic world, I think it's safe to say.
He's like a force of positive change in the world, and he's bringing like a fresh aspect to the Catholic Church.
And what excites me is the whole world is getting to see what are the basic essential elements of what constitutes Catholicism.
We have to be able to be motivated, as Pope Francis would say, by the joy of our companionship, trying to vigil, do prayer, do penance for something that's really valuable in our world.
We have over 1,200 people here on Capitol Hill today to take leadership as a country for positive change.
And I feel like everybody here can either be that change or can spark up somebody to be the change.
I'm John Dickerson, host of CBS This Morning. In a time when political discourse can often be divisive, I subscribe to America Magazine because it is a platform for respectful dialogue from a variety of viewpoints.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to America Media. It is my pleasure to welcome Father Matt Malone, the editor-in-chief of America Magazine, to the podium at this time to offer introductory remarks. Father Malone.
Good evening, my brothers and sisters, and welcome. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our headquarters here at America for the 51st Annual John Courtney Murray S.J. Lecture. And I also welcome the folks who are watching at home via the live stream. This lecture was established by my predecessor, Father Thurston Davis, the seventh editor of America, after whom this room is named. And since its founding, it has been a forum for leading figures from religion and public life to share their experiences and to express their worldviews about how faith, morals, duty, public life all intersect and interplay. And in the spirit of Father Murray's work, who was a leading social and political theorist, an expert at the Second Vatican Council, an associate editor of this review, we gather here to welcome this leader to our conversation. Tonight, Ambassador R. Nicholas Burns follows in the footsteps of Ted Sorensen, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Roberto Cardinal Tucci, among others, many, many others, and most recently, Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute and Harvard University, and we are very delighted to have Ambassador Burns with us. His bio is included in your program. I will just say that there were two things that prompted me to invite the ambassador. The first was we had to have a Red Sox fan this year. Who could give this conversation. That was absolutely critical. And as I was thinking about that, I was watching Narcos on Netflix, which is the series about the drug wars in the 1980s, and the ambassador makes a cameo appearance at one point from newsreel footage behind the podium at the State Department. And I said, let's get that guy. I think I know him. I think I know him from the BC board, and I know he's a Red Sox fan, and he's a proud son of BC, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome our Nicholas Burns here to this podium.
Matt, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. When I entered Matt's office today, I saw a Red Sox jersey. I knew I was in the right place. We're both native-born members of Red Sox Nation. We know we're behind enemy lines here in Manhattan, but we're still proud to be here. And I'm a great admirer of Matt, which is one reason why I leapt at the opportunity to give this lecture tonight. Not only do we have Boston politics and the Boston Irish community together, we both admired Robert F. Kennedy. I was 12 when Senator Kennedy died, and Matt and I saw the tributes to Senator Kennedy in Matt's office tonight, and I knew I was in the right place, and I thank all of you for being here this evening. It's an honor to be with the Jesuit community as well, I must say, and I'll explain why in a minute. Matt and I serve on the Boston College board together. We're both devoted to Boston College, and it's a real honor to deliver this lecture, named after John Courtney Murray, S.J. He was a remarkable man, Jesuit priest who was silenced at one point in the 1950s by the Vatican, but played a major role at Vatican II. And his scholarship was on an issue that's fundamental to the United States and to our history, and that's the separation of church and state. That's what he wrote about quite often in the latter part of his life. And that scholarship is important to this day for reasons that you will all understand. I also want to speak tonight about an issue that's central to the mission of the Jesuits, and that is helping to restore to the government of the United States a sense of moral purpose and what that government is about and what it should do for the people of the United States. But before I get into that, I wanted to say one more word about the Jesuit order. When I arrived at Boston College a long time ago, in September 1974, as an 18-year-old, I really had only the vaguest notion of what the Jesuits were all about. But then I took freshman English with Father Phil Molesky, and then sophomore American history with Father Tom Gray, and then my senior year French literature class with Father J.T. Gautier. We called him Père Gautier affectionately. I began to understand what the Jesuits were all about, and I drank all the Kool-Aid, and I make no apologies for that. And two of our three daughters, my wife and I have three daughters, are graduates of Boston College, and they benefited from what I benefited from. The Jesuit professors, the Jesuit order, insisting, of course, on academic rigor and discipline. But beyond that, the Jesuits insisted there's something more important, and that is to light the world, that is to be in service to others. And this is a hard message for 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Your life is not just about you. Part of your life has to be about the community. It has to be about the nation. It has to be about the world. And part of your life has to be in sacrifice to that. That's the fundamental message of the Jesuit order as I understood it as a young person. And I certainly don't claim tonight to be in any way, shape, or form an embodiment of those Jesuit values. But we try. And we try very hard now as a trustee of Boston College to imbue that to our students there. BC is a remarkable place. We've had, over 47 years, 2 presidents. And that's a real gift to have the imprint of 2 men, 2 Jesuit priests on our institution. Some of you may know the name of the late Father Donald Monin. BC was nearly bankrupt when I was there. He saved Boston College from bankruptcy, and he lifted the university up. He put us on a very strong financial footing and made us into a national university right through to the 1990s. For the last 23 years, BC has benefited immensely from what I would say is the insightful, steady, purposeful leadership of Father William Leahy. Our academic base is very strong. Our alumni are very enthusiastic about the college. I was at the Florida State BC football game last Saturday. We lost, and yet the spirit was there. And Father Leahy has worked very hard to retain the Catholic base and foundation and history of the school. And our students are volunteering for service in record numbers as freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. So I just wanted to pay tribute to the Jesuit order, to the extraordinary network of high schools and colleges that the Jesuits have built here in the United States. And I've lived in 7 countries around the world, all around the world. And I wouldn't be anywhere close to the person I am today had it not been for Boston College and had it not been for my Jesuit mentors. And I wanted to say that, Matt, as I started tonight. Just as universities like BC need to have a moral compass to guide them forward, that's true of nations as well. And I want to talk tonight about the United States, about our place in the world, and about the challenges that we're facing. The United States, if we think about the moral base of the country, has been a revolutionary nation throughout its history. We're the only nation born and structured on a set of ideas about liberty and about human freedom. And if you think of the foundation stones of our country, they are visionary documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution as amended, the Bill of Rights. And our entire history since the 18th century has been to live up to the true meanings of the words, a more perfect union. That goal, a more perfect union, has been a continuous and often very difficult and perplexing journey for the American people. The legacy of race, for example, is not just part of the past, but it's unfortunately all too present in 2019. A few years ago, I had a fascinating conversation with Ken Burns. We're not related, but we're friends. And he told me that I think he's made 26 or 27 films. In all of his films, with maybe 3 exceptions, race is a fundamental part of the story he's trying to tell. Whether it's baseball, think Jackie Robinson, whether it's jazz, of course the Civil War, which was fought over it. And I've never forgotten that, of race as part of our bloodstream, as an agent in the bloodstream of the American people, because we know our history. We know the Constitution consigned African Americans to be 3/5 of a person. The Harvard historian Jill Lepore, in her magnificent 1-volume history published 2 years ago of the United States called These Truths, described it this way. She wrote, "Liberty and slavery became, for the United States, for the American people, our Cain and Abel." And that's the very start of our national story. And she reminds us that while the American Revolution did free white men from the tyranny of empire, it did not decidedly free the slaves, and it did not accord to women the rights of men. So one way to read our history, in Jill Lepore's version of the history, which I greatly admire, is that this is a struggle to form not just a more perfect union, but a moral union. And that struggle continues 240 years after the founding of the country. The most critical event in the history of the United States is the Confederacy's rebellion against the Union. It's the right way to describe it. It wasn't really a civil war. It was the rebellion of the Confederacy against our Union. We lost more soldiers in that 5-year period, 1860 to 1865, than in all of the rest of the wars we have ever fought until this day combined. Nearly every family in the United States statistically lost someone between 1860 and 1865. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, there were delirious crowds welcoming it in places like Boston Common and here in New York City. But then it took 100 years after that proclamation to actually redeem it in the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. And even after the historic election of Barack Obama in 2008, we've seen the return of race and racial bias and racial discrimination in the United States. What else can we conclude after Charlottesville? After the repeated shootings of unarmed African American men by law enforcement, after the open racism by some, not all, but by some at the Trump rallies, and I would say the open racism of the president himself and what he has said and what he has failed to do. So this more perfect union, this moral union, has always been about extending rights, We finally did that in the 1960s for African Americans. But the LGBT community, women, Muslim Americans, those persecuted by ethnicity, race, gender, color, that's an unfulfilled struggle towards a more perfect and more moral union in the United States. We Catholics are certainly not immune from the challenge. I continue to wonder, for example, why my two cousins, sister Maureen Toomey, sister Kathleen Toomey, both in religious orders since the late 1950s, both still hard at work in Springfield, Massachusetts, and Worcester, Massachusetts, in their 80s. Why can't they take their place alongside men on the altar, saying the Mass, leading the Catholic community? The moral of this long, circuitous story is that a nation can only be effective as a global leader in its foreign and defense policy if it's grounded at home, if it's attached fundamentally to its foundational values. And I worry that the United States, for all sorts of reasons, is not strong at home, that we're divided at home. And if we take a good, long, and frank look at ourselves on the eve of the critical year 2020, we should determine that shoring up our democracy at home, addressing the core issue of race, of income inequality, and of the incredible divisions, red-blue, north-south, liberal-conservative, urban-rural. We're a divided nation, not as divided as during the war in the mid-19th century to free the slaves, but divided nonetheless. Lincoln warned us of a house divided, the perils of a house divided in a democratic society. And that's a critical point for us to think about and talk about and worry about and do something about in 2019 and 2020. I've spent my whole professional life not here at home. I've spent a lot of it overseas as a diplomat for the United States, living in all parts of the world, West Africa, Middle East, Europe, traveling around the world. And it's interesting to look back at your country and to see how incredibly powerful we are. We are right now the leading military power in the world, the leading economy in the world, by far the most influential political power in the world. We have enormous cultural influence in the world. It's second to none. I don't think we're a power that's waning. I think we'll be the single most influential country in the world 20 to 25 years from now. But we've got to be strong at home if we're going to be effective in using that power. And I do continue to believe, and I hope many Americans haven't lost faith in this, that our destiny is to be a beacon to the rest of the world. We're far from that now in November of 2019. But that doesn't mean that we should give up trying to encourage the trees of liberty and of democracy to prosper in places around the world where authoritarian regimes are currently in power. We've struggled with this question of this original promise of America that we should try to proselytize, in a way, our democratic values and instill them, at least help others instill them in foreign lands. We struggle to do that, what the founders asked us to do. The Jesuits would say it's lighting the world. And the founders didn't agree, all of them, on this vision. Jefferson saw America's agrarian democracy as an example to others in an age of empire. But Washington warned of entangling alliances. John Quincy Adams agreed with Washington and said of America, July 4, 1821, America should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But a few decades later, Lincoln described America as the last best hope of mankind. Several decades after that, Teddy Roosevelt willed us to become a global power at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. But then Woodrow Wilson could not convince the Senate in 1919 and 1920 to ratify the League of Nations Treaty, and isolation set in. 2 long decades of isolation, so that we chose not to be present when Hitler and Mussolini rose to power, when they began the Second World War, September 1st, 1939, and the consequences in part of our isolation were catastrophic. 60 million people died in the greatest mass killing in all of history between 1939 and 1945. Beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, with his third term, however, in 1940, we managed through his extraordinary leadership to close the divisions of the 1920s and 1930s in our country. FDR aligned with Churchill. In the Battle of Britain, when the democracies truly had their backs against the wall. And then 16 million Americans went into uniform, men and women, and they willed us, with our allies, to victory by September 1945. In the post-war years, we had a consensus in the United States between Democrats and Republicans. It was a visionary insight. It was the first time that Americans had said in the history of the country, to protect ourselves at home, we must be abroad. To protect the United States, we must establish what Washington warned us against, entangling alliances like NATO or our East Asian alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. They resolved, Eisenhower, Truman, John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, they resolved never to return to isolation, but to engage permanently overseas with the rest of the world. We surely didn't get everything right post-1945 in this new role for the United States. Vietnam wasn't right. Supporting right-wing military dictatorships like the Marcos regime in the Philippines, or the Shah of Iran, or the white Africana Nationalist Party until the late 1980s, that wasn't right. The Iraq War of 2003, one of the most consequential mistakes we've made in modern history. Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, stains on American society. But for the most part, after 1945, in creating a rules-based liberal order, in defending democracy against the Soviet Union, in helping to unify Germany, in supporting the integration of Europe after the 500 years of divisions in Europe, in providing billions of dollars to increase food production and to eradicate diseases. We got many more things right after 1945 than we got wrong. There was a moral basis to America in the Truman Doctrine, defend democracies against communism. There was a moral base to John F. Kennedy going to the Berlin Wall in 1963. Let them come to Berlin. There was a moral base in Ronald Reagan going to the Berlin Wall in 1987. Tear down this wall. And there was a moral basis to George H.W. Bush. Europe should be whole, free, and at peace. And I would say a moral basis to George W. Bush and Barack Obama, both expanding NATO to include all the countries of the Warsaw Pact, the formerly communist countries, so that they could finally be free from the Russian bear. That America, our America, is still there. Just look at the recent public opinion polls. They're really quite enlightening. The Pew poll and the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations polls, both of this autumn, they show that Republicans and Democrats are united in supporting NATO, in supporting the idea of alliances, that actually, given all the drama about free trade, Republicans and even Democrats, who've traditionally been anti-trade, believe in free trade. By lower margins, but still majority of Americans say, we're an immigrant nation. We should take in immigrants. We're a refugee nation. We should take in refugees. There is solid public support, if you look closely at the polls, for everything that our president is arguing against. In the last 2.5 years, when President Trump has been in the White House, I fear we've lost the moral anchor to our society and our government. And that was an issue, society and government, that John Courtney Murray thought about and wrote about. Who can argue otherwise when we reflect on all that's been lost and all that we have not done since President Trump took office? Under his leadership, we're failing to act on the greatest moral issue of our time, climate change. And we may only be able to act after he leaves office, when it is too late to make the kind of difference that we have to make for our kids' generation and our grandchildren's generation. President Trump has zeroed out all American aid to the Palestinian people, all of our bilateral aid, and we've withdrawn for the first time in 70 years our funding for the Palestinian refugee camps in Syria and in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Gaza and the West Bank. I spent 3 days in the West Bank last week and saw the alarming drop of credibility of our own country because we have lost faith with our obligation to support the Palestinian refugees. We have slashed immigration in the last 2 years in our immigrant nation. And we're only taking in 19,000 refugees this year. We're supposed to take in 70,000. That was the funding that Congress wanted to give the Trump administration. And there are 68 million refugees and internally displaced people in the world today. That is the highest number since the summer of 1945, when the world was blown apart, and we are choosing to be AWOL. Think about the Catholic Church's concern for immigrants and refugees. The Catholic Church is one of the leading advocates in the world for refugees and for immigrants, and the United States choosing not to stand up for them. And choosing not to stand up for democracy in Hungary and in Poland, where democracy has really been challenged, in Turkey, where an authoritarian leader was embraced in the Oval Office just this afternoon, and in Hong Kong, where our voice has not been heard over the last 6 months, as brave people have taken to the streets to demonstrate for rights that were given to them in the 1997 agreement between the People's Republic of China and the United Kingdom. When President Trump leaves office, whether he's removed from office after a trial in the Senate, or more likely at the polls 1 year from now, we're going to need to rebuild. It's going to be the greatest reclamation project in American history. The State Department is shattered. The FBI and the Justice Department and CIA are under assault from the President of the United States, from Representative Nunes in the impeachment hearing this morning. And we have got to very deliberately rebuild the foundations of government, rebuild the trust of career government employees who are being vilified for being career government employees. And we need to launch that reclamation project at a time when history hasn't stopped. The world has not stopped spinning since the United States went into our existential crisis. The world misses the strength and the constancy and the credibility of the United States. And the world is changing in one important respect. And I saw this in working for President Clinton, in working for President George W. Bush, and advising Secretary John Kerry. Many of the greatest challenges we face cannot be resolved, obviously, by the United States acting alone. And in a way, we've arrived at the first time in human history when the fate of everyone on Earth, there are 7.6 billion of us, is now linked. If you think about what climate change is, it affects every person in the world, in every country, and can only be arrested if every person and country is behind an effort to do something about it. And right now, of the 195 nation states in the world, there are 194 nations in the fight. And there's one nation that has decided not to be in the fight. That's us. Think of climate change. Think of the threat of pandemics. Think of drug and crime cartels. Think of the whole range of cyber problems, from cyber espionage to cyber theft to cyber aggression and war. We've arrived at a point in history where unless we go out to meet the problems and create the coalitions, and actually are in the coalitions to do something about them, we suffer here at home. The 18th century Americans, like Jefferson and Washington, and even young John Quincy Adams, could look out and say, the Atlantic and Pacific will always protect us. That was the 18th century. We live in a very different 21st century. I think the greatest imperative, however, is what I started with. It's the moral limitations of this presidency. among all his initiatives and speeches and the nonstop tweets, you will not find a single noble, far-reaching goal that challenges America to be its best. It's not impossible to imagine a different future. Beyond Trump's crude and caustic tweets, his divisiveness, his persistent incivility, his cruelty to people as he talks about them, we are still capable of choosing women and men in both parties who can lead us back to the place that we know we must be. We need desperately to lift our sights and to remember that until very recently we had two very different presidents named George W. Bush and Barack Obama, but they were both men of exceptional personal character. Here's an example of what I'm talking about, the lack of ambition to think about doing great things, noble things. When I was a young kid, I'm a lot older than Matt. We both grew up around Boston. In the 1960s and 70s, as a young kid, as I listened to our politicians, they would say, vote for me, I'll bring you peace. And this was the World War II generation running for office in the 1960s and 70s. Peace was considered the highest ambition of the country. And anyone wanting to get elected had to say, I'm for peace. That word peace has literally disappeared from our national conversation. Do any of you remember any candidate, maybe with the exception of Mayor Pete or Joe Biden, who say that peace has to be our abiding concern? It's disappeared. What's replaced it? Security has replaced it. And that's understandable because we were attacked on 9/11. People feel threatened. And so now people say, vote for me, I'll make you secure. I buy that. I want to hear that. But I also want to hear something beyond that from our politicians. Is it really true that we don't have an ambition that we can live in a peaceful world? I mean, think about our greatest leaders. FDR on the Depression and War. Truman and Eisenhower in the Cold War. Lyndon Johnson, and especially Dr. Martin Luther King on the crucible of civil rights. They challenged us in each of those crises. Be better, be stronger, achieve a higher aspiration. They challenged the American people to defeat the Depression, to win World War II, to be constant in the Cold War, and to be right on civil rights. Why can't we live in that kind of world? And why can't we think of ourselves as a country capable of achieving that kind of thing? Here are the opportunities. The world has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty, the greatest number in global history in the last 4 decades. We can lift another 1 billion people out of poverty if we decide that's a national and global goal. We can eradicate polio and malaria in the lifetime of the older people like me in this room. In the next 20 years, we haven't eradicated a global disease since smallpox. We can extend to women and people of color the rights and opportunities that they've been denied. Most of the women in this room have been denied their civil rights, rights of opportunity. Our society can change that. And we can certainly create a carbon-free America, let's say by 2050. I teach millennials and have 3 millennial daughters. I spend a lot of my days with millennials. They think they can do that. Wean us off carbon and create an environmentally friendly world. We can do all this, but we need leaders who agree. We need leaders who are consumed by something beyond their own pocketbook or personal ambition. We need leaders like President Kennedy, another person that Matt and I admire both very much. He went to the American University in June 1963, 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after he'd looked into the abyss of a total nuclear war. And the title of his speech was A Strategy for Peace. He said, peace with the Soviet Union. This is the crucible year of the Cold War. So we should be ambitious as a country, post-Trump, not just to survive it, the tsunami that we're in, but to rebuild the country and the moral base of the government of the country and to have no limits on what we think we can do, right, to accomplish. Think of Tennyson, 19th century British poet. Robert Kennedy's 1968 campaign autobiography was entitled To Seek a Newer World. Come, my friends, to seek a newer world, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. Tennyson, seek a newer world. Why can't we dream of that kind of world? Who else but Catholics? To think about human perfection, to think about embracing the problems of the world and conquering them, to think about not putting limits on yourself or your society about what can be done to improve America, to renew it, and to create a world of justice and civility and peace. I don't think that's beyond the people of the United States. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you bear with us quickly, we're just going to have a quick set change. We're going to bring out some chairs for the conversation, and we'll be back in about 45 seconds. So.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know what is required to put together a talk like that, and I appreciate the challenge that you have offered us. So we're going to have a quick conversation here. I have a couple of questions, and then we'll be happy to open it up to your comments or questions too. You spoke of the United States being in an existential crisis, right? You said, before we entered our current existential crisis. I think sometimes, you ask an existentialist what that means, and they'll give you a different definition, right? Sometimes it means you've forgotten who you were. Sometimes you realize you're nothing. What do you mean by that? And what is the nearest precedent in American history for this moment?
I think the nearest precedent might be the isolation of the 20s and 30s, when we forgot what had made us successful in the First World War, and we absented ourselves from the greatest moral crisis of that time, the rise of fascism. We were literally not present to contain Hitler and Mussolini. And by 1910, the United States was the largest economy in the world. We were the largest industrial power of the world. In 1918, we had 2 million American soldiers in France. 1918, the First World War. We had 450,000 American soldiers up on the Marne River defeating the German army in July, August 1918. We were a colossus, and we decided to act like a pygmy. We decided just to isolate ourselves for 2 decades. That's probably the nearest precedent. Why do I say we're in an existential crisis? Because from a foreign policy perspective, what made us great, to talk in Trumpian terms, after 1945 were 4 things, in my judgment. Number one, we decided we had to have allies in the world, that they were the power differential with the communist forces. And that's what NATO and the East Asian allies have been. President Trump has is at best ambivalent about NATO, but he's diminishing our alliances, and he's got a go-it-alone strategy. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that we created after the Second World War a multilateral trade system of laws and rules and agreements that lifted about 1 billion boats, those billion people who came out of poverty, largely because of market forces, not because of government aid, because of the power of the market unleashed in a free trade environment. And the president is dismantling the free trade regime and returning to the kind of raising of fences, building of walls, digging of moats. That was really how America approached trade in the 18th century, when we were a struggling young republic and worried about competition from the British Empire. You have to go back to the 18th century to see these kind of philosophies. Number three, we're an immigrant nation. Matt, if you and I went around the room, we asked every single person in the room, where are you from? And we didn't mean the Bronx or Queens or Mashpee, Massachusetts, where Matt's from. We meant, where are you from? We've each got an immigrant story. And the president only now, and he said it, wants to take immigrants from Sweden and Norway. And he's put together policies that will keep Muslims out of this country. From 9 majority Muslim countries, I've joined a class action lawsuit against those policies. We've lost in court, but we're persisting. And he's anti-immigrant and anti-refugee. And fourth, the fourth thing that made us great was our fundamental belief in democracy at home, but democracy overseas. Not that we fight wars to impose democracy. We've usually gotten into trouble when we do that. But at least we stand up for it. How's the president doing? Who's he embracing? Embracing Xi Jinping, embracing Kim Jong-un, embracing Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Erdogan in the Oval Office today, a love fest, and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. Who's he consistently criticizing? Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Theresa May, Justin Trudeau. This is taking what made us great and turning it on its head. He's rejecting what made us great, and he's weakening us. And we have got to recover that sense of purpose about who we are. It's an existential question. Who are we? How do we act in the world?
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. The editorial page, the editorial board of this magazine has always been pretty intensely critical of this president and his administration for some of the reasons that you cited. But we're also, I think, careful to point out that he's not the cause of this existential crisis in as much as he is its principal beneficiary. Another way of asking this is, was there some crisis already in the American body politic that he was able to exploit and continues to do so today?
Well, he's a brilliant politician. He defeated the Bushes and the Clintons, the two political dynasties of the country in the last 40 or 50 years. In 2016, he knows how to condense complex subjects into make America great again. I mean, brilliant phrase. Who can argue with that? But I don't think he's the harbinger of larger majority forces. What happened after 2008 and 9 is that a lot of Americans lost jobs. A lot of 401k accounts were hit hard. People looked at the morass of Iraq, our war there, 8-year occupation. We're going on now 19 years in the war in Afghanistan. And a lot of people wanted us to, our politicians, rightly so, to pay more attention at home. Massive income inequality in the United States, and the president, you have to give him credit for this, saw it and at least talked about it, I think insincerely, given how he's governed. But he saw the income inequality. He saw the two Americas. There was a young Catholic who wrote about the two Americas in the 1960s, famous book, Harrington's book in the 1960s. Trump saw that too and capitalized on it. But I don't think he is somehow articulating a majority view in this country, not even the Republican Party. And all those foreign policy issues I talked about, Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, for instance, don't agree with him on Russia, don't agree with him on NATO,
Right.
don't agree with him on democracy. I think he's a unique figure. And in my, my own view is we need to vote him out of office if the Senate doesn't remove him, which I think the Senate probably will not do at this point.
There is, I think it's probably fair to say that in the last, 20 years, particularly with the events of 2008, our politics has transformed from one which is our electoral politics, between one which is principally structured by divisions between left and right, and to one in which analysts are saying it's really increasingly between those who are in the political classes, the elites, and those who feel dispossessed, right? These very people that you just mentioned who saw Wall Street, this is their view, saw Wall Street almost blow up the world, right? And yet they're the ones who lost their houses, right? The dispossessed, right? The folks that almost blew up the world seem to escape responsibility for it. So, and into that space comes Trump, and it seems to me that there's an understandable anxiety or fear or criticism, which one of those folks who lost their house might level toward you, which is to say, the American consensus about its commitment to the world and all of that, that's important. It is a part of who we are, but you know what? I mean, we almost blew up the world here, and I lost my house. And the folks who are all talking about this on the cable news and on the op-ed page of the New York Times, they're not listening to me. Do you think that there's something real there, don't you think?
Oh, very definitely. In fact, not only has Donald Trump seen that, but Elizabeth Warren's seen that, and Bernie Sanders has seen it. Our three wonderful daughters are all supporting Elizabeth Warren, in large part because of this issue. And I think, it's understandable. We have a regressive tax system. When I was growing up, we had a progressive tax system. Now it's regressive. The wealthier get wealthier. The middle class impoverished. The poor get poorer. More of the load's on them. We have a very weak social safety net in the United States. I mean, I am not for a socialist economy, but I've lived in enough countries around the world to see that worker retraining is done very well. Vocational training in Germany, not so well in the United States. If you lose your job in France or Belgium or Greece, 3 countries where my family and I have all lived, you're not impoverished. You're not out in the street. You're not left without devices. Society is there to come and help you and support you, not just welfare payments, but real strong social safety net. There's a communal sense to European democracy, which I think we don't have here. It's a very Catholic thing to feel communal. It's a very Catholic thing to feel that we're related to each other. In fact, we should be related to the poorest among us more than anything else. So you bet that Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, I think especially Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in a very sincere way are saying we have to change America in big ways because our economy is fundamentally unfair. I would say to the person, if they said, well, look, you're an elite, you teach at Harvard, why should we be putting so much effort overseas when we're suffering at home? We've got to do both. We're going to ruin the planet if we don't do something about climate change. That's an international vocation as well as a domestic vocation. We cannot keep ourselves safe, and New Yorkers know this from people like Osama bin Laden, if in some way, in an intelligent way, not in a stupid way, we go out and meet the challenge in the Middle East. I'm not talking about invading Iraq. I'm talking about the kind of thing that President Obama did and that we had in place in northern Syria until a month ago. We had just 200 special forces holding down 1/3 of the territory of Syria, with the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds. And that was a place where refugees could go, where women were not assaulted, where people could at least survive this brutal war. 500,000 people dead, 12 million refugees. This is Syria since 2011. We pacified that part of Syria, until President Trump just withdrew the troops, foolishly, in my view, a month ago. So I'd say to this person, I've met a lot of people like this, including in my own family, by the way, my nuclear family, my extended Irish Catholic family. It's a big family, as all of them are. We've got to do both. It's not a question of just coming home and resolving our problems here. We've got to be strong at home and strong overseas. And I just tried to make the link here. that we cannot be strong and credible overseas if we've got a race problem, or if we're fundamentally unequal, or if we're so divided politically that we can't congratulate the other side. Matt and I were talking in his incredible office before we came on, and I was mentioning that when President Trump ordered the killing of Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, that was a Saturday. The next day, I don't think a single one of the Democratic candidates, and there are about, 231 of them running, I don't think a single one of them said thank you to President Trump. They thanked the military. I'm not trying to puff myself up. I went on MSNBC a couple days later, and the first thing I was asked about this, I thought the first thing we should do is thank President Trump. And I'm an opponent of President Trump, but when he does something good, you have to thank him. And I said some tough things about him. He's right about China trade. He's right that the Chinese have ripped off the intellectual property of a lot of firms on Wall Street. He's not wrong about everything. And so I think if we're going to be loyal opponents in a democracy, you have to praise the other side when they do something that you've been campaigning for. And we don't even seem to be able to do that. I mean, and the Republicans today, if you watched any part of the impeachment hearing in the House Intelligence Committee, the two people who testified were both close friends of mine, George Kent and Bill Taylor. I've known them both for decades and worked with them very closely. The leading Republican, in his opening statement, vilified them as never Trumpers and creatures of the swamp, this kind of thing, when they are the most nonpartisan, straightforward, straight down the middle people, straight arrows you ever want to meet. They're not political. Right. So I love what Ellen DeGeneres has been saying. Can we please be kinder to each other? Yeah. Can we please not yell and... I mean, some of you may say, what a hypocrite this guy is. He just lambasted Donald Trump. Well, he's the president. He deserves it. But for the rest of us, I mean, can we please have a civil disagreement across the divides? I
think we have some time for some questions and comments. I know that there's a microphone circulating there. Just one thing before we go there to the audience. This statistic keeps rattling around in my head. You know, in the last presidential election, one of the closest in American history, the result would have been different if some votes had gone, just a few thousand votes had gone different in some
68,000
very small
in 3
places.
states.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exact.
So you have, and yet, 80% of Americans live in a congressional district that voted for either Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton by 20 points or more. So how do you have this conversation if we don't even live in the same place and we're not reading the same newspapers and we're not following the same feeds? How does that happen?
Right, and I'm not smart enough. It's not my field. You would have much better ideas. I'm not smart enough to give you the list, but we clearly have, through gerrymandering, and both parties do this, by the way. It's not just the Republicans if you're a Democrat. And both parties are guilty of it wherever they have the majority. In most other countries of the world, Britain, for example, electoral districts are not set by local legislatures. They're set by an independent body that is non-political, say between the Tories and Labour in Britain. That's the way we should handle that problem. I think, you know, the media is complicated. We had a brief discussion just when I came off the stage. I think our newspapers are fine. If you look at the reporting, tomorrow morning, pick up the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Their news reporting articles about the impeachment hearing will be nearly identical. What will differ will be their editorial pages, which is where they should be. I think the problem is in our TV. I was on MSNBC at 4:45 today. That you can't, it's hard, you're hard pressed to find anybody who's willing to say a single good word about Donald Trump. And if you go over to Fox, it's the reverse. And most people are getting their news from those stations or from platforms similar to it on, you know, on our iPhones. And I think that's the big problem. If most people are getting their news from visually, they're not getting straightforward news. They are getting it if you read the newspapers, but not the visual media.
Yes. I know we're doing it at America Magazine, but we have you this year. Last year we had Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute. That's one way we're trying to...
Thank you for doing that. He is
together.
an incredibly smart and good person.
Yeah, there's a tricky button.
Ambassador Burns, thank you for a lucid and also poetic presentation. Really a pleasure to hear you. I wanted to ask about norms, because that seems to be something that we have really lost in our society, and whether the rollback of women's rights can be really very swift and fairly unforgiving, or whether you are an African American, and I heard on NPR this morning that 80% of African American students just get no exposure to civics. I wanted to ask you about norms and civics in the last, let's say, 50 years of the life of the United States, and whether that's at the core of our distrust of American institutions, which is something that I really have a hard time swallowing, because that's what's made us great.
It is what made us great. This is a multifaceted question. It would require maybe an entire course at any university, and so it's a really good question. I just say, in a way, there are things that we can do in our communities, school committees, towns, counties, states, to really answer your question. What our kids are taught in school, whether they have civics in 4th, 6th, and 8th grade, is not the decision of the president. It's the decision of towns and school committees, and that's where it should be, at the local level. And how we choose to include or not include people. And thank you for your comment on women. Nothing radicalizes a man more than having 3 daughters and a granddaughter. It's radicalized me. It really has. When you see that there are barriers, even in 2019, even in Boston, to my daughters, it infuriates you. So thank you for raising that. But we can deal at a community level with a lot of these problems of how do we treat each other? What's the basis of our local democracy? Do we gerrymander or not in New York State or Massachusetts? That's our decision. That's not the president's decision or Mitch McConnell's or any Democrat's decision in Washington. But then again, point 2, final point, you need leadership from the top. I will just quote me from my conversation with Father Malone, not him. I was a very young person in the government when Ronald Reagan was president, and he did a lot of good things. But it always bothered me when he said the government was the problem. And now we see the vilification of government. 2 words I'd never heard attached to the United States, only to authoritarian dictatorships, that President Trump now says there's a deep state in Washington. As if the people who join the FBI are not loyal Americans, or the people who join the CIA, or George Kent, or Bill Taylor, the 2 men who had to face the Klieg lights this morning in the Congress when Devin Nunes, the lead Republican, said, you guys are just props on a stage and you're part of the problem. And the American people, he said, have lost confidence in you, in the State Department, he named, State Department, Justice, CIA, and FBI. I think Devin Nunes is completely wrong. I think the American people understand that people join the government. It's a selfless thing. You don't make a lot of money. If you talk to our military officers on a 1-year master's degree program, and the first thing I say when I meet them one-on-one is, where have you been? Where have you served in the last 10, 15, 20 years? To the older ones, 5, 6 combat tours. The most intensively deployed generation in the history of the United States, my nephew Ben, Marine Corps pilot, colonel, 200 combat missions, 5 combat deployments away from his family. And so that's the deep state. That's how we treat people who sacrifice for us. I mean, we need local action, but we need good leadership. And you heard my speech. I don't think we've got a good leader. But with a good leader, that woman or that man can really instill confidence in us, can begin to break down these barriers between the R's and the D's, and make us understand we're Americans first, Republicans and Democrats second. That's the kind of leadership we need. And boy, I'll take it from either party right now, given the trouble that we're in.
I have a question that would ask you to leap forward in your thoughts another 10 or 20 years and focuses not on our leaders, but on we, the Americans, who from time to time may elect them. And it's sort of a softball about whether you think we as Americans are educationally, emotionally, or politically capable of coping in an affirmative way for the day when we are not the lead economy, are not the most militarily powerful, are not the most politically persuasive. And I say that against the background that those of us who were born in the 1930s or 40s or perhaps even 50s grew up and prospered in an economy that the world had never seen before, substantially because the rest of the world was flat on its ass after World War II. But by 1970, we began to see importation. By 1980, we began to see the financialization of our industry and of our economy with corporate takeovers and LBOs and please, Mr. CEO, close the factory, fire 5,000 people, and see your earnings per share go up by 10 cents. And we disemployed and disadvantaged tens of millions of people. And yet we still have this myth of being exceptional. We are number one in this, that, and the other. And I'm curious about whether we're capable of coping in an affirmative and not a negative way when we are no longer the number one economy, no longer the number one military power, no longer the number one political influence in the world.
What a great question. And like your predecessor question, that's a whole course. And I teach a course called Great Powers at Harvard, and I'll just give you 2 or 3 points to answer your question. If you look at where we are now as a people, 326 million Americans, we are the most innovative and successful economy. We're the largest and most powerful military. We're most politically influential. We have an incredible amount of soft power, attractiveness of our culture. I actually don't see us losing that edge. In absolute terms, if you measure it in absolute terms, we're going to be the number one power on those 4 metrics 10, 20 years from now. I'm quite certain of that, unless we collapse, which we're not going to do. But in relative terms, here's your question, others are gaining on us. China's closing that gap. By mid-century, India and Nigeria and Brazil may be closing the gap on us as others begin to atrophy, the Europeans, the Russians, for instance. But I like our chances because, and I don't want to give the baton of number one leader in the world. None of us have ever lived in that America. You have to go back 85 years to live in an America that was not the greatest global power. I don't want to live in a world where China's the greatest power, not Chinese communism as the greatest power, or some successor to Putin, some strong man is going to rival us militarily. I think it's important we remain the world's leading military power and political power. Economically, I like our chances because I live a mile from MIT. And whether it's MIT or Caltech or Carnegie Mellon or UT Austin, if you think about biotechnology, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the changes in those 4 fields over the next 30 years, 40 years, might be greater, the impact on society, on our economy, than the information revolution has been over the last 40. And we have the brain power. We have the innovation economy and the entrepreneurial economy. I think the economics part of this is the most important part of it. And so keeping Wall Street strong, but reforming it, keeping the California tech companies strong, but understanding there has to be some minimal regulation on Facebook, that's going to be the great public policy challenge, not robbing the United States of its economic strength. I worry about the Democratic left, over-regulation on what made us great economically, our entrepreneurial economy. But if we can do that, there's no reason why my 2 grandchildren, Charlotte and Max, and your grandchildren won't live in an America that's the leading power in the world. I trust us with the power. I don't trust the communists in China. I don't trust Putin with that power. So, boy, we could have an interesting discussion of this issue if we had more time.
Time for one more.
you spend a lot of time with millennials, and one way or the other, and I'm just wondering what you think about the idea of obligatory national service. I'm not talking about draft, but as a way of bringing people together in a way that they are often not brought together in regular society. We live in our bubbles in Manhattan or Boston or wherever it may be. So any thoughts on that? I know two recent Marine Corps veterans, Seth Moulton and Jake Auchincloss, Harvard grads, are advocates of that. What do you think?
I'm with them. I think we ought to have national service. Stan McChrystal's another military officer, great four-star general, who believes he's launched the Franklin Project, saying that our young people have to have a sense that they're part of the global national community and that they owe something to the country, whether it's in our towns or counties or states or the federal government. And it can be the military. It can be some modern version of the Civilian Conservation Corps, that brilliant Harry Hopkins, Eleanor Roosevelt, and I think in this order, Franklin Roosevelt idea. And it'll allow people, that's an awkward age, 18, 19, 20, give them an experience outside themselves. It's very Jesuit, Matt.
Yep.
It's very much what the Jesuit order and the Catholic Church and Boston College and Georgetown and Fordham want our kids to do. I'm all in favor of it. There's so much need in our society, and I think a lot of young people will respond to it. They'll understand the virtue of a gap year where they can get away from their parents but do something important outside of themselves. I'm conscious of one thing in an audience in a night like this. You know, when asked to talk about America right now, that was a pretty heavy presentation about race returning and the domestic problems and the existential crisis and our international problems. So I want to end on hope, if you'll allow me to do this.
Please.
And this is a true story. I have to talk a lot for a living because I'm a college professor. And several years ago, my wife Libby came to such a lecture at Harvard, talk about global trends. And I talked about all the things that can kill us. And Libby and I were walking home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I said, "How did that go?" And there was a pause. And she said, "You're depressing everybody." And this was one of the most important teachable moments, truly, my wife, my beautiful wife, she said, "I get that there are all sorts of challenges out there, but what are you hopeful about? And what are you analytically hopeful about? Where are the hopeful global trend lines?" So I listened to her, and I now poll my students at the end of every semester, and I teach big classes, 65 to 90 students, and usually from 15 to 20 different countries. We're a mini United Nations at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And so I'm getting a millennial global view. I poll them, and I say, "Don't tell me what you wish for, utopian world peace forever," although that was part of my speech. Tell me what you analytically think is possible in your lifetime to achieve in a hopeful way. Here's the poll that came back in May from 65 students from 15 countries. They're hopeful about poverty alleviation. I gave you the figure. About 1 billion people lifted out of poverty. China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Caribbean, Brazil mainly, over the last 40 years. That's the highest number ever. And if we would just continue to unleash the market forces and be smart about where we put our aid money, another 1 billion people can be lifted out of poverty in the next 30 to 40 years, number one. Number two is the Global Health Index that I talked about. It has been since smallpox, since we last eradicated a global disease. Polio now exists in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. There was an outbreak in Damascus a couple of years ago during the war, but it's been arrested. And if we can get vaccine programs into isolated villages in those 3 countries, polio can be eradicated. Bill Gates thinks that a malaria vaccine is possible in the next decade. And if you then distribute it, 500,000 kids below the age of 5 died of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa alone last year. Think of the lives saved. Think of the human potential. That was number 2 in my students' list. Number 3 was the rise of women. And in a global class like mine, it's certainly not happening in large parts of the Muslim world, and that's 1.7 billion people. But it is happening here, slowly, painfully. And it's happening in a much bigger way in Western and Northern Europe. And if you're in Sweden, Finland, and Norway, and you run a corporate board, 50% of the members of that board legally must be women. We've not done that yet. I think California is about to do something like that, and I think all of us should consider push this forward, compel it forward. Why would we want to limit more than half the population of the United States from being productive citizens? My students, my male students, are passionate. You can imagine what my female students think of this. And fourth is the promise of technology. And finally, I consistently get this on this poll of students. Older people like me might think that technology is a double-edged sword. Bill Gates has warned us about the ethical problems of gene editing. And yet younger people, I think appropriately, can see the promise. We can cure cancer. We can make a carbon-free America and world. I wanted to leave you that hope because young people, I mean, we're handing the baton, at least my generation is handing it to them, the baton of leadership. They are empowered. They're incredibly impressive. People in my generation like to complain about the millennials. I won't have it because we have a great young population in this country ready to do great things. And I wanted to just leave with some hope on a night like this.
I'm
Matt.
glad you did. Though I will take the host prerogative and ask one last question. As you look back over the last 119 years of American history, is the Boston Red Sox a great team or the greatest team?
Well, Matt, obviously. We're in a room full of New Yorkers. They'll point to the 27 Yankee championships.
Mm-hmm.
But the team with the heart and soul is Red Sox Nation. I'm sure we'll come back next year.
Amen. The editors of America insist that I remind you that on your program there is a text to subscribe number, 833 Jesuits. Many of you are subscribers to America, and I thank you. If you are not, it is only a venial sin, and this is how it is remedied. You can just text the word subscribe to 833 Jesuits, and you'll be signed up in a matter of seconds. I also want to invite you to join us on December 4th for a special program on the anniversary of U.S. v. Nixon, which is the Supreme Court case that brought down the Nixon presidency. And we are going to have here on the stage Phil LaCavara, who, as a very young attorney, argued that case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And we're going to talk about, obviously, impeachment in a historical sense, but also how it is, what's happening today is and is not different from what was happening then. And you are all warmly invited to a reception in our newsroom. And please join me in thanking Ambassador Burns for this wonderful presentation.